Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. For tonight, I invite you to spend the next hour or so in the world of antique furniture. I will also tell you about the history of furniture from prehistory to the present day and around the world. We will elaborate a little more on French furniture, how it was made, the different types of materials used, and the evolution of styles, types of furniture, and techniques, such as veneering and gilt bronze over the centuries. Furniture also reflects the way people lived, changes in style, and the evolution of the decorative arts. We're going to make a long journey through time and space. But before we dive deep into the story, I'd like to tell you that if you want to support us directly, you can do so on Patreon starting at $3.50 per month and enjoy ad-free listening, exclusive episodes, downloads with or without background sounds, and early releases. Every patron receives everything regardless of their contribution, because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. Links are in the description of the episode. And now, before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries. Assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. And when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. And make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, off we go. If we take a look at the beginning of human civilization, it is hard to know exactly when the concept of furniture was invented. It is likely that early humans used natural objects like rocks or tree stumps as rudimentary pieces of furniture to sit on or work on. But it is hard to know exactly when people began intentionally making furniture. That is to say, objects designed to support human activity, such as sitting, working, eating, sleeping, or storing things. It is believed that the construction or carving of furniture began at the end of the Paleolithic or the beginning of the Neolithic, which would mean at least 12,000 years ago. The change in lifestyle of some human communities from a nomadic to a sedentary life probably gave them an incentive to create furniture, the need to store things, and later the search for greater comfort required new artifacts to be made. What we can be sure of is that there were at least chairs or thrones 8,000 years ago, because several figurines dating from this period show women sitting on what is obviously a man-made piece of furniture. It could have been made of rock, wood, or bone. Maybe these first pieces were lost, or they simply haven't yet been discovered, because the oldest surviving examples of furniture that we know of date from around 5,000 years ago and were discovered at Skara a Neolithic village on mainland, the largest of the Orkney Islands in Scotland. I made a story about it in the episode about Stonehenge. Skara was a Neolithic site where people built stone houses with a surprising level of comfort and sophistication for the time. They had beds, dressers, shelves, cupboards, and seats, all made of stone. Stone may not have been the easiest material to work with. They probably used it because there was a shortage of wood in Orkney. But because these pieces were made of stone, they have survived for thousands of years and were discovered almost intact. At the time when the small community of Scarabray lived in the north of Scotland, the ancient Egyptians had already occupied the Nile Valley, and their first dynasty, the first series of kings to reign over a unified Egypt, was already established. The first dynasty ruled over an already sophisticated society 5,000 years ago. They had probably already started to make furniture several centuries earlier. But the Egyptians used light materials that were easily destroyed or that might have been reused. There is not much evidence of Egyptian furniture before the first dynasty, but evidence such as drawings and carvings from the first dynasty indicates an already advanced use of furniture in houses, which is why it probably started earlier, even though direct evidence is scarce. Furniture design was one aspect of Egyptian crafts and art, and furniture was used throughout Egyptian society. One of the earliest types of seating used by everyone, from ordinary citizens to the royal family, was the stool. Stools were generally rectangular and made of wood, sometimes with wooden legs and a woven seat. Chairs with backs were much less common, and only wealthy, high-ranking people had them. It took a long time for them to reach ordinary houses, which they did during the 18th century, in the second millennium BC. The Egyptians also made tables, beds, and chests for storage. There was a lack of suitable wood for making furniture in Egypt, so a lot of it had to be imported from other places, especially from Phoenicia, which corresponds roughly to Lebanon today. When it came to high-end furniture, the Egyptians developed a decorative tradition using plenty of other materials. There was leather, gold, silver, ivory, and pieces of ebony. Ebony is a precious wood. There are different species native to West Africa, India, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia. It is valuable for its high density. It is very heavy, so heavy that it sinks in water. It is dark, and when polished, it can take on a mirror-like finish, which makes it valuable as an ornamental wood. Because good wood was scarce and expensive, and also for decorative purposes, the Egyptians developed the art of veneering and marquetry on luxury furniture. They could typically use panels of less expensive material and cover them with thin slices of better wood glued to them. This technique is still very common. It is called veneering, and much mass-produced wood furniture uses it nowadays. It may not have exactly the same feel as solid wood, but it has other advantages apart from cost. It is more stable. Solid wood is prone to warping and splitting over time because of expansion and contraction caused by changes in humidity. Veneered furniture, when the veneer is applied to a stable material such as plywood, can be less prone to these changes and may stay intact for longer. Marquetry is a craft. It consists of applying pieces of veneer to a structure to form decorative patterns. It is not limited to furniture. It can be used to decorate small objects too, and not only with small pieces of wood. A lot of different, generally valuable materials have been used throughout history. It was already used in antiquity around the Mediterranean, and remains have been found in Egypt and at the site of Pompeii in Italy, a Roman city which was buried in the 1st century, showed that the ancient world was already highly advanced in decorative inlay techniques. Then marquetry didn't disappear completely, but it became rare throughout the Middle Ages until a revival in Europe in the 16th century, starting in Italy. It flourished from the 16th to the 18th centuries, while related decorative techniques also used materials such as marble, semi-precious stones, mother of pearl, and tortoiseshell. The use of tortoiseshell became fashionable at the end of the 17th century. A lot of furniture at the Palace of Versailles at the time of Louis XIV, the Sun King, was decorated with it. Many different patterns became fashionable in high-style furniture, depending on the period and the country. Geometrical patterns inspired by Islamic art and foliage or floral patterns that were especially popular in France in the 17th and 18th centuries were also Chinese-inspired patterns, especially in English furniture from the 18th century. One of the most famous furniture designers of the 18th century in England was a cabinet maker called Thomas Chippendale. He made a wide variety of pieces at a time when the Rococo style was fashionable and the Neoclassical period was beginning. I'll tell you more about these styles when I talk about French furniture in the 18th century. Chippendale became especially famous for his elegant carved furniture, often made of mahogany, and his designs incorporated several influences, including Rococo, Gothic, and Chinese-inspired elements. He worked for wealthy and aristocratic clients, and his published designs also became very influential among other cabinet makers. Returning to the ancient world, after Egypt, another civilization that left a long tradition of furniture making was Greece, and later Rome, which took much of its inspiration from Greece when it came to the decorative arts. The main material used in Greece was also wood, but wooden pieces have not survived. We know of them from various sources, literature, painted vases, and sculptures. Some pieces have reached us when they were made of metal or marble. The Greeks had an extensive vocabulary for furniture. For example, when it came to seating, they distinguished between different types. There was the basic backless stool, which was common in most houses. There was also the klysmos, which was a light chair with a curved backrest. Unlike Egyptian chairs that had a full back, a klysmos had a small piece of wood just where the person's back needed to lean. The word throne is derived from the Greek thronos, It was a full, heavy seat designed for deities or individuals of high status. Of course, there were thrones long before Greece, but they probably proliferated at the time in the various temples and cities of ancient Greece, and could be heavily ornamented with imported materials like ebony, precious stones, or ivory. The Greeks also used a type of furniture called the klein, or kleine in the plural, which can be seen as an ancestor of the sofa or daybed. It was a multi-purpose piece that could be used as a bed, as a couch, or for reclining during meals. It was rectangular, supported on 4 legs, with an armrest or headboard on one side. This type of piece is uncommon today, but it still exists in various forms. It had a revival at the end of the 18th century, when a lot of inspiration was drawn from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. The Greeks also produced a lot of tables. It seems they were small most of the time because in depictions of banquets, it appeared that each participant had their own table rather than sharing a larger one, and people reclined on a klein to eat. The Romans probably produced more furniture than the Greeks, given the size and duration of their empire, but their furniture was heavily influenced by Greece, and the boundary between the two traditions can sometimes be blurred. They changed the styles of decoration, but many of the techniques, materials, and types of furniture were closely related. Now, if an ancient Greek or Roman were to travel through time and see the inside of our houses, they would probably be surprised by the quantity of furniture, with so many tables, high and low seats, cupboards and racks, and we would probably find a Roman house quite empty by comparison. An ordinary house in ancient Rome generally had relatively little movable furniture, a few seats, a table, a bed, and a chest for storage. Even inside a wealthy home, we wouldn't necessarily find that many pieces. This was not really because furniture was too expensive, but because of how people lived. They didn't need a lot of bookshelves or storage spaces, and much of the decoration in luxury homes was part of the home itself. There were frescoes or mosaics on the walls, patterns on the floors, and much of the furniture was essentially functional. It was not necessarily intended to be the central part of the decoration. Now, historically, there were furniture-making traditions all over the world, from the Americas to Africa to Asia. We cannot talk about everything, but it is worth taking a look at East Asia, especially China, where furniture making also started thousands of years ago. In ancient China, the interior of houses was often rather sober when it came to furniture, but luxury items were also created and richly ornamented. Styles changed a lot over time, and at some point in the 17th and 18th centuries, Chinese furniture and decorative arts influenced their European counterparts, not so much through the shapes, but rather through the decorative motives and the use of materials and techniques, such as porcelain and lacquer. Chinese ornamentation was highly inspired by painting, including tree branches and flowers and bamboo. Animals were also frequent on furniture, like lions and ducks and peacocks and butterflies, and sometimes there was calligraphy. There were cabinets that were made for storage of documents or clothes. The Western idea of a wardrobe designed primarily for hanging clothes vertically was not traditional in China. Chinese wardrobes and cabinets did exist, but clothes and bedding were often stored folded inside them or in chests. There were also separate clothes racks on which robes and other garments could be hung or draped. A lot of Chinese furniture was painted or lacquered. In contrast, traditional Japanese furniture often had a more minimalist appearance, and many pieces emphasized the natural grain of the wood, although lacquered furniture also existed. The types of furniture were rather similar, but the Japanese also developed their own pieces, such as the tansu, which became a traditional form of storage cabinetry during the Edo period. Contrary to the Western tradition of using more stationary furniture, tansu were often designed to be movable and were not always visible in the home, which could appear rather empty. They could be kept out of sight in storage rooms or storehouses, or displayed in shops. Many had iron handles for carrying, and some types were even fitted with wheels for easier transportation. Depending on the occupation of their owner, they could contain account books for merchants, medicinal herbs for apothecaries, or sword blades for blade makers and polishers. There were also smaller versions that served as chests on ships. Nowadays, these tansu are highly valued as Japanese antiques, even though they were essentially designed as functional objects rather than purely decorative pieces. Returning to the West, with the end of Rome began a long period that includes almost all of the Middle Ages, when the evolution of furniture making slowed considerably in Western Europe. It took centuries for Europe to recover economically from the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and with some local exceptions in larger cities, monasteries, and royal courts, the production of high-end furniture declined, and the types of furniture became less diverse. There are very few pieces remaining from before the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, but based on visual documents like religious art and the Bayeux tapestry, we know that some forms of furniture continued traditions inherited from the Roman world. Bayeux tapestry is a very long cloth embroidered in the 18th century. It depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest of England. Its exact origins are not known, but it may have been made in England, and it was probably commissioned by Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, and half-brother of William the Conqueror. It tells the story largely of the Norman point of view, and it was probably intended for the Cathedral of Bayeux, Normandy, where it remained for centuries. Apart from its value as a historical artifact, it is remarkable for its size. It is almost 70 meters long, close to 230 feet. There are more objects left from the end of the Middle Ages, from the 14th and 15th centuries, and at the time, apart from seats, a very common type of furniture was the chest. Their decoration often reminds us of Gothic architecture and Gothic art in general. with pointed arches, rosettes, and other elements associated with the Gothic period, as well as crowns, knights with shields, fleurs-de-lis, and characters from the Bible. At the same period, furniture was more diverse and used more complex decorative techniques in the East, in the Byzantine world, which had kept many Roman traditions alive. But in Western and Northern Europe, the practice of veneering had declined, and most furniture was made of solid wood. When it was decorated, it was more often with designs carved directly into the wood, rather than with other materials. In comparison with what would be made in the following centuries, much of this furniture looked rather rustic. Things began to accelerate again in Europe in the 16th century with the Renaissance, and from then on, the appearance of new forms and changes in style became much more constant. There were several factors behind this. First, there were more financial means. With economic growth and the expansion of international trade, new fortunes appeared, and demand increased among different segments of the population. There was also a change in lifestyle for the aristocracy and the wealthy merchant class. Old fortified residents from the Middle Ages were increasingly replaced or transformed into more comfortable chateaux, palaces, and large houses, with more light and a completely new interest in interior decoration. Another interesting difference from today is that furniture did not necessarily stay permanently in one room, or even in one residence. Royal courts and wealthy aristocratic households often moved between different palaces and country houses, and valuable furnishings could move with them. Furniture also had to be moved around within a residence, depending on how a room was being used. This helps explain why chests, stools, benches, and tables that could be moved or taken apart remained so practical for such a long time. There are some remarkable examples of furniture actually designed with transportation in mind. A French table made around 1570, known today as the Sea Dog table, could be completely dismantled into 17 separate pieces, making it much easier to carry and move from one place to another. It seems strange to us because we think of a large, luxurious table as something permanently installed in a room. But in a great house of the 16th century, even an extremely elaborate and expensive piece of furniture could be designed to travel. For those wealthy enough to spend money on it, much artistic patronage during the Middle Ages had been connected to religious buildings and institutions. But starting in the Renaissance, secular demand for works of art, painting, sculptures for decorative gardens, and also furniture grew considerably. Finally, starting in the Renaissance, there was a rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman influences. This went far beyond furniture and touched all the arts and architecture. For centuries afterward, many major styles of furniture design continued to draw inspiration from antiquity, whether in their shapes, decorative patterns, or the themes of their decoration. New types of furniture appeared and reappeared too, like the ancestors of modern cabinets. At first, in the 16th century, they often looked a lot like a chest placed above a table or stand. Desks also multiplied from the 17th century, and around the beginning of the 18th century, a new type of storage furniture became particularly important in France, the chest of drawers or dresser. There's a lot to say about the 17th and 18th centuries, and I'm going to tell you about French furniture from this period. Let's not forget that during these periods, the bulk of furniture produced for ordinary houses was actually quite cheap and simple. It was essentially functional. What we call the great styles of the 17th and 18th centuries mainly refers to a much smaller production made for wealthy people. But still, even though these pieces represented only part of the furniture produced, there were more wealthy customers than in previous centuries, and a considerable amount of this furniture was made, especially in countries like France, which already had a large population. As a result, surviving antique furniture from these periods is still relatively abundant. Of course, pieces vary enormously. High luxury pieces made for royal courts or important aristocrats can be unaffordable to most people and often end up in museums or major private collections. But if you look at the category just below that level, antique furniture can be surprisingly affordable, and some pieces cost less than high-end modern designer furniture. Decorative arts and furniture across Europe evolved towards the Baroque style, which was characterized by opulent designs, often gilded and made to impress, sometimes on monumental scale. An example of this is the Louis XIV style. It corresponds to the period when Versailles was transformed into the immense royal palace we know today, and new furniture was created to furnish it as the impressive display of wealth and power that it was intended to be. There was an emphasis on rich materials and abundant decoration. Louis XIV pieces were often strongly symmetrical to reinforce their monumental aspect, and to our taste, given what happened afterward, they can look rather heavy and very loaded with ornaments. Actually, furniture that was primarily decorative rather than purely functional became important at the time. For example, there were consoles, which were long, narrow tables made to be placed against a wall. They typically served to display ornaments, sculptures, clocks, or other precious objects, rather than for sitting, working, or storage. Other new types or new forms of furniture also appeared at the time. I mentioned the chest of drawers before. The dresser developed around the end of this period as a new form of storage furniture, with drawers placed one above the other. Large armoires also became increasingly important, generally with two doors opening from the front. This period also saw the development of forms that are recognizable as modern desks. People had been working on tables and writing furniture for centuries, of course, but by the late 17th century, large writing desks with drawers and a broad flat surface had appeared. Under Louis XIV, they became larger, wider, and more comfortable to work on. One last type of furniture that became spectacular was the royal or aristocratic bed. Beds varied greatly in size and form, and in the countryside in many parts of Europe they could be enclosed with wooden panels to keep the warmth inside, almost as if people slept in a large cabinet. But at the court of Louis XIV, the royal bedroom became a public and ceremonial place. Every morning when the king woke up and got ready, there was a formal ceremony called the lever. It was an honor to be allowed to attend, and an even greater privilege to take part in helping the king dress. Different groups of courtiers were admitted according to their rank and privileges. Following the example of the royal court, it was also common among aristocrats to receive visitors while in bed. State beds became increasingly spectacular, with very high canopies, elaborate fabrics, and rich decoration. Some had 4 posts supporting the canopy, while other types had canopies suspended or supported in different ways. Draperies could surround the bed so that it could be closed at night, almost like a very fancy tent. At Versailles, a balustrade separated the king's bed from the rest of the bedchamber. On the other side was the more public part of the room, where privileged courtiers could attend the king's morning ceremony. This elaborate court etiquette did not disappear with Louis XIV. His successors continued with many of these ceremonies, although they often preferred a more private life and did not always follow the public rituals with the same enthusiasm. By the last decades of the reign of Louis XIV, the style of furniture began to evolve towards something less grandiose and more elegant. It was still very symmetrical and full of symbols representing power, like lion paws, faces, or suns, but pieces of furniture became less massive and monumental. They also started to include more curves, as opposed to the more geometrical shapes of the earlier style. During the late 17th century, gilt bronze mounts also became increasingly important in high-end furniture. The use of metal in furniture, either as decoration or to protect vulnerable areas, had existed since antiquity. But when it came to creating the appearance of gold, only a very thin layer of gold was needed. One important technique was the use of gold leaf. Gold is a very ductile metal, which means that it can be hammered into extremely thin sheets. The surface to be gilded was first carefully prepared, often with layers of gesso and a fine clay called bole. The extremely thin gold leaf was then picked up with a special tool called a gilder's tip and carefully laid onto the prepared surface. Another interesting thing is that the hidden parts were often really left quite rough. The wood was worked by hand, and parts that were not visible were often much less carefully finished. Tool marks and irregular surfaces on the back, underneath, or inside a piece of furniture can actually provide useful clues about its age and how it was made. However, this is only one clue among many. Mechanical sawmills existed in Europe long before the 19th century, although mechanized woodworking became much more widespread during the Industrial Revolution. Machine-cut wood tends to show more regular marks than wood worked entirely by hand, so examining the hidden parts of a piece, the back, the underside, the inside of drawers, and the joinery, can help determine when and how it was made, but it cannot give us a date with certainty by itself. Still, even in high-end furniture, parts that would never be seen could be left surprisingly rough. Backs that were going to be placed against a wall, for example, might receive very little finishing, almost like the backs of a theater set, which in a sense some of these grand reception rooms were. Another important form of gilded decoration is called ormolu, or gilt bronze. The word comes from the French ormolu, which literally means ground gold. In 18th century French furniture, decorative bronze mounts were often gilded and attached to the furniture. Charles Cresson was trained as both a cabinet maker and a sculptor, and he became particularly renowned for the very luxurious and expensive pieces he created with an abundance of gilt bronze decoration. Gilt bronze was produced by taking a decorative piece of metal, usually bronze or brass, which was first cast and then carefully finished and chased. It was then covered with an amalgam of mercury and gold. Gold has the ability to dissolve in mercury, and after the amalgam was applied, the object was exposed to intense heat. The mercury evaporated, leaving a layer of gold firmly attached to the surface. This type of mercury gilding was very durable, although the gold could still wear away over time, especially on projecting surfaces. But the technique was also highly toxic because of the mercury fumes. Its use was restricted during the 19th century and gradually declined, and nowadays it is extremely rare. There are much safer ways to gild metal, such as electroplating, without the same health risks. Gilt bronze was not used only for furniture. It also served for candelabras, clocks, and decorative mounts on porcelain pieces. In the 18th century, it became a particular specialty of French craftsmen. A similar mercury gilding technique could also be used to apply gold to silver. Silver covered with gold is known as silver gilt or vermeil. So, as I told you, the Louis XIV style progressively evolved, first through the Regence period, and then toward a new style that dominated the middle of the 18th century, Rococo, which in France is closely associated with the Louis XV style. But furniture in Italy, Germany, or England, I mentioned Chippendale in England before, followed related trends and tastes, although each country developed its own variations. The characteristics of the Louis XV style include an abundance of ornaments combined with a sense of movement. There are lots of curves. Straight lines and rectangular forms increasingly gave way to swelling, flowing spaces, sometimes almost like the curves of a violin. You can see this in desks, chests of drawers, clocks, legs, and the balls of seats. Louis XIV furniture was quite formal, often box-like. In contrast, Louis XV pieces were generally lighter and designed with greater emphasis on comfort. They could also include asymmetrical elements, and by the middle of the period, unusual and luxurious materials such as Asian lacquer panels and porcelain plaques. The production of Louis XV furniture became extensive among wealthy clients. The style began at the royal court and among the aristocracy, but it was soon emulated by other wealthy households, not only in France, but elsewhere in Europe. So, over time, many chateaux and mansions were furnished in this style. Overall, in Western Europe, the 18th century was in some respects more stable than the 17th century. There were still major wars, but some regions were spared the prolonged devastation that had marked parts of Europe in the previous century. France itself was less often a battlefield, although fighting did reach French territory, especially during the first half of the century. At the same time, populations grew, trade expanded, and new private fortunes flourished through trade, banking, and manufacturing, especially in Western Europe, in France, England, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. So demand was very strong, and it was kept strong by fast changes in fashion when it came to decoration. Actually, the Louis XV style ultimately went out of favor in the second half of the 18th century, but it never entirely disappeared. It continued to be copied in the 19th and 20th centuries, and since then, it has gone in and out of fashion. Apart from the aesthetics, maybe it remained popular because this period, in the first half of the 18th century, helped shape a more modern concept of interior decoration, with a search for furniture that was comfortable, brightened the mood, and adapted to personal taste. At first, it was mainly a reality for the aristocracy and the wealthy, and it remained out of reach for most people for a long time. For ordinary households, furniture was expensive and often kept for many years, or even passed from one generation to another. But the practice of changing your decoration or making it evolve throughout your life, depending on your lifestyle and your taste, became increasingly important among wealthy households about 300 years ago. And over time, this practice spread to a much wider part of society. Western furniture reflects this too. Pieces were easily movable, and they could be rearranged or moved from room to room, depending on people's needs and social interactions. Around the year 1760, the style began to change again. Together with the rise of the Neoclassical movement, Neoclassicism was all about a renewed fascination for antiquity. Not that it had been forgotten before, but during the 18th century, the ancient cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii began to be systematically excavated. Interest in archaeology surged. Travelers and artists went to sites in Greece and Italy and promoted a taste for the aesthetics of the Greco-Roman buildings and art. This strongly influenced architecture, painting, sculpture, and the decorative arts. Maybe there was also a taste at the time for rational thinking. This is the period of the Enlightenment. Philosophers and scientists were more influential and widely read than ever, and a return to something less exuberant and somewhat simpler looked attractive when it came to decoration. All of this strongly influenced furniture making, and in France, the new neoclassical style became known as the Louis XVI style because it corresponds largely to the reign of this king in pre-revolutionary France. The transition did not happen overnight, and a lot of pieces mixed characteristics of the new and the old styles. The Louis XVI style became firmly established in the 1770s, and its main characteristics were straighter lines and more simplicity than in the previous period, although it was still very ornate. It included a lot of elements inspired by how antiquity was perceived at the time. Legs could look like Greek or Roman columns. Symmetry was back, and ornament became more orderly and restrained, although gilt bronze mounts could still be very elaborate. At the same time, Louis XVI furniture retained much of the color, refinement, and comfort of the Louis XV period. More than ever, people who could afford this wanted versatility and elegance rather than anything too ceremonial or heavy. Like Louis XV furniture, Louis XVI pieces were produced in considerable quantities, and some of the most prestigious pieces were exported across Europe. A great deal of French furniture also left royal and aristocratic collections during and after the French Revolution. The revolutionary government sold thousands of lots of furniture and decorative objects from Versailles and other royal residences. British collectors acquired many important French pieces during the following decades, and some eventually entered collections such as the British Royal Collection and the Wallace Collection in London. Later, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, wealthy American collectors also developed a strong interest in French 18th century furniture. Many of their collections eventually entered museums, which is one reason you can see so many important French pieces in American museums today. One particularly fascinating development in the 18th century was mechanical furniture. Some luxury pieces were almost machines, with complicating mechanisms hidden inside them. Among the most famous makers were Abraham Röntgen and his son David, German cabinet makers whose workshop became one of the most successful in Europe. Their desks, tables, and cabinets could contain hidden compartments and secret drawers, and sometimes just by turning a key, several parts of the furniture would move or open automatically. Some pieces even incorporated clocks or musical mechanisms. The Röntgens became famous throughout Europe, and their clients included Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette in France, Catherine the Great of Russia, and the King of Prussia. Their workshop eventually employed almost 200 specialized craftsmen. These pieces were extremely expensive luxury objects, but they are interesting because they show just how advanced furniture making had become by the end of the 18th century. A cabinet or a desk was no longer necessarily just a static object. It could be a complicated piece of engineering, designed partly for practical purposes, but also to surprise and impress anyone who saw it. Furniture in the 19th century would be hard to summarize because there were many trends coexisting, many of them based on the imitation of or inspiration from previous centuries. With the Industrial Revolution, demand for furniture grew dramatically, more than in any previous century, and the cost of furniture dropped with the industrialization of production. I mentioned mechanical sawing earlier, but there were many more new techniques that gradually turned furniture from unique pieces or very small series made by craftsmen into industrialized products made in large series. When it comes to fine furniture, there were several revival movements: Neo-Gothic, Neo-Baroque, and more Neoclassicism, including another style at the very beginning of the 19th century called Empire. At the time of Napoleon, this style returned to a more monumental approach, with many pieces directly inspired by ancient Roman furniture. The lion paws returned, tables and seats became a bit more massive. There was also inspiration from ancient Egypt, which received renewed attention following the military expedition to Egypt led by Napoleon in 1798. Egyptian motifs became particularly fashionable and were incorporated into empire furniture and decoration. As the century advanced, there was no single direction in furniture design. Some styles were relatively simple, while others were extremely ornate, and revivals of Gothic, Rococo, Renaissance, and other historical styles existed side by side. This also reflected a changing society. The bourgeoisie had become increasingly important economically and socially, and created a huge new market for furniture and interior decoration. In America, enormous new fortunes also appeared during the century, and wealthy collectors developed an increasing interest in European art and antique furniture. With the rise of bourgeois society, another important change was the spread of the dedicated dining room and furniture, specifically designed for it. Dining rooms had already existed in wealthy houses before the 19th century, but during the late 18th and especially the 19th century, they became much more common. Before that, rooms and tables were often multi-purpose. People could eat in rooms that served other functions, and for large dinners, tables could be assembled or rearranged for the occasion. But over time, the dining room became a standard part of more houses, together with the furniture specifically associated with it: dining tables, sets of chairs, sideboards, and other pieces. By the end of the 19th century, there were also artistic movements that inspired furniture and reacted against an increasingly industrialized society, where products were becoming more standardized, and against a perception that the decorative arts were declining. An example of this is the arts and crafts movement, which had its center in Great Britain, but also reached America and continental Europe. It stood for traditional craftsmanship against mass industrial production, and it found inspiration in older medieval and vernacular styles of decoration. Its influence continued into the 20th century, even as design moved increasingly toward modernism and experimented with new forms and materials in both furniture and architecture. But the concern for preserving traditional skills and craftsmanship never entirely went away. It still exists today. A paradox of the arts and crafts movement is that it was a reaction against standardization and industrialization in the 19th century, but at the same time it strongly belongs to this period. The nostalgia for ancient times that were perhaps a little idealized or the aspiration to reproduce the qualities of the past are very much aspects of 19th century design and art. Another attempt at finding a new style at the end of the 19th century was Art Nouveau, or the modern style, which appeared around the same time as the arts and crafts movement and shared some elements with it. Art Nouveau was partly a reaction against the taste for historicism and against the constant reproduction of ancient or exotic architecture, furniture, and decorative arts from previous centuries. It tried to invent a new aesthetic, a modern aesthetic inspired by natural forms, like the curves of plants and flowers. It did not necessarily reject industrialization. Designers experimented with modern manufacturing techniques and materials, such as iron, steel, and glass, especially in architecture and interior decoration, and used them to create new shapes. So in this sense, Art Nouveau was very modern, but it went out of favor in the early decades of the 20th century. And to us now, it has a very distinctive period look. Actually, some of its flowing, organic shapes can remind us of the aesthetic we sometimes see in fantasy movies. If you take the Lord of the Rings movies, for example, you can see something reminiscent of Art Nouveau in the architecture and decoration of places like Rivendell. Since the 20th century, multiple styles have coexisted, but the one broad movement that has dominated furniture making, and that we strongly associate with the past several decades, has been modernism. There have been many different aesthetics within this broad movement, such as Art Deco in the 1920s and 1930s, and the Bauhaus, which tried to create a new approach to the design of objects and buildings based on modern materials and techniques, but at the service of people's everyday lives. Then in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, many designers continued this trend toward modernism. After the Second World War, furniture designs incorporated even more new materials and new ways of using existing ones, such as plastics, fiberglass, laminated plywood, aluminum, and stainless steel. Designers were interested in creating furniture that could be mass-produced, but also comfortable and visually appealing. A famous example in the United States is Charles and Ray Eames. During the Second World War, they had worked on techniques for molding plywood into curved shapes, and they even produced molded plywood leg splints for the U.S. Navy. After the war, they applied what they had learned to furniture. Their molded plywood chairs from the 1940s used thin layers of wood pressed into curved shapes that followed the human body. Then around 1950, they produced chairs with a single molded fiberglass shell for the seats and back. The idea was to combine comfort, modern materials, and industrial production. Other designers experimented with completely different forms. In the 1950s, the Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen created his famous tulip chairs and tables, supported by a single central pedestal instead of 4 legs. Around the same period, designers in Scandinavia became particularly influential. Scandinavian furniture often combined modernist simplicity with traditional materials like wood and an emphasis on craftsmanship and comfort. Designers such as the Danish Hans Wegener And Arne Jacobsen created chairs that are still produced and copied today. Italy also became an important center of modern furniture. Italian designers often combined industrial production with a strong interest in elegance and form. One famous example is Gio Ponti's Superleggera chair from the 1950s. Its name means superlight in Italian, and the design reduced a traditional wooden chair to an extremely light and slender structure. Later, especially in the 1960s, designers experimented even more freely with plastics and other synthetic materials, making it possible to produce furniture in shapes that would have been extremely difficult to make in traditional wood. Industrial production in these new materials helped make many designs more affordable and also increasingly international. There were different schools of design and groups of designers with very different approaches, but ideas circulated rapidly from one country to another. During the 20th century, many influential design ideas came from such places as Scandinavia, Italy, Japan, and the United States. Furniture styles also became less closely associated with the court or reign of a particular ruler, as they had been in previous centuries. Instead, they became associated with designers, companies, artistic movements, or sometimes entire schools of design. At the same time, interiors became increasingly eclectic. Modern furniture could be placed next to antiques, while new furniture could itself borrow shapes or decorative ideas from the past. In a way, this brings us all to where we are today, with many different styles existing at the same time and people choosing and combining them according to their own taste. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or if you are not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.